You're listening to the Why Japan podcast with Michael Tang. Hey everyone, and welcome to the 7th episode of the Why Japan podcast. Every episode, I interview a new guest who lives in Japan, starting with probably the most asked question for all foreigners living in Japan: why Japan? Because there was a huge gap in releasing episodes, I wanted to release this one day after episode 6. It also just makes sense because it's a two-parter anyways. Nevertheless, as always, if you enjoy the podcast, please do the usual, such as liking the podcast, subscribing to it, sharing it on your social media or other platforms. Anything you do would be super appreciated. Let your friends know that they can find us at whyjapanpodcast.com. In part 2 of this episode with Seralyn, we dive a little bit into what it's like being transgendered in Japan, the entertainment industry, and how Japan will or must learn to adapt to these growing changes in society, and more. Without further ado, here's episode 7 with Seralyn Campbell, part 2. So Seralyn, kind of changing topics here, but something that you hadn't mentioned yet was that you are transgendered. If you like, give us a summary or brief history on your experience with that, and also how is Japan like with their treatment of transgender foreigner, because I think that adds like an additional layer of complexity. Instead of simply being a foreigner in Japan, you're a transgender foreigner. And has it ever become a problem in a professional setting that you've worked with, or even personal?
As I mentioned, I was born and raised in northwestern Mississippi, male. And, I played football and stuff and tried to be the best boy I could be, but it wasn't me, it never was. I was growing up where I did, there's no, especially in the time period that I did, because I'm 36, so when I was growing up, there was no social dialogue about this whatsoever. The word trans anything, it was a slur, it was a there was no, we didn't talk about this in public, we didn't have anything positive to say, it was just the butt of a joke or something, and that was my entire experience with it. And I had these weird feelings about my gender, but I had no outlet in which to discuss them or try to analyze them. So I just kind of shoved it all down, and by the time I got in my mid-20s, it couldn't be shoved down anymore. I had made the decision to transition while I was still living in Memphis, and I had started hormone replacement therapy about 6 or 7 months before I was slated to leave for Japan. But I didn't socially transition until I reached Japan. So that means, I had begun the medical process, which takes years and isn't entirely evident in the beginning. But I didn't tell anyone about it, really, other than a few close friends before I left Memphis. And, started my social transition in Japan, actually. So I did my transition basically in Japan. And
so what does that mean when you say medically and socially? What is the difference?
So medically transitioning would be actually altering the state of my body to better match the gender that I have rather than the sex that I, came out of my mother with. That part is usually done by hormone replacement therapy. So men typically have large amounts of testosterone and women have estrogen. We actually both have both. It's just the proportions, right? So I suppressed my testosterone and supplemented with extra estrogen, and that made a lot of changes in my body. And I began that process when I was still in Memphis, but it didn't start to be visually obvious until around the time I made it to Japan. So there were changes I could detect, right? But if you just looked at me, and I'm still dressed like a boy and stuff, you don't really notice too much. People who are very close to me were like, your face looks kind of different, So that's the as far as it went with people noticing before I left Memphis. But socially means I started wearing women's clothing in public, styling myself the way I would like to, which is something that I did not let myself do when I was still in Memphis because, I had so much going on. I had, an international move. I was selling everything that I owned, literally, except for what would fit in a few suitcases. I was trying to get paperwork for all these things, and there was just so much going on for me to handle that, as well as explaining to people, oh, by the way, please think of me as a woman now, because that was just too much. So I waited until I got to Japan, where I had a clean break, right, and I could just introduce myself to everyone as as Seralyn, instead of trying to because anytime that you do something, anytime you even change your style, your friends are going to give you shit about it, dressing in a lot. For example, I'm looking at you now and you've got on, a gray and white striped shirt and some jeans, but what if you decided you wanted to start dressing like a goth right now? All of your friends are going to give you shit. Your family's going to give you shit, right? But if you started dressing like a goth at the same time you moved to Paris and everyone who met you only knew you as the goth dressing Michael. In that case, people just accept you for what you are. And that's, I thought, would be a very conveniently timed period for me to begin my social transition. And it was. I also knew that Japan was more tolerant of people that were bending gender norms.
Than the US.
Than the US. More tolerant. Not accepting. There's a difference. It just means that they see it, they recognize it, and they don't particularly put up a big fuss. It doesn't mean they like it. Doesn't mean they want people to do it. It just means they're not going to hit you over the head with a brick. They're not going to scream at you and chase you down the street in a truck.
Like they would in the States.
In some places in the U.S., especially where I'm from. So I knew it would be safer for me physically to do my transition, my social transition here, and it was. I mean, I'm not going to say I didn't get any weird looks when I was early on in transition because, you know, there's always an awkward phase. There's a phase where I kind of look like a guy and I kind of look like a girl. Every trans person who transitions faces this. It's not an overnight snap where you just look, you know, different overnight. But there's also a period where dressing in either clothes looks out of place. It's not that I wanted to behave differently. It's that I wanted to stop curbing my behavior. I always had to curb my behaviors and try to act like a man before. And it was just a matter of me stopping that act. But anyway.
This was during your first time coming to Japan?
I know this would have been when I moved to Tokyo.
Okay.
So this would have been, I was 26. You know, I haven't been back to that particular part of Kyushu that I lived before. I don't know if anyone would recognize me. Anyway, yeah, so I did that stuff here, and like I said, I did get some looks, and I occasionally got a comment here and there, but nothing confrontational. You know, someone mumbling under their breath as they walk by or something.
Wow.
But not nearly as much as would have happened in the States. You know, I would have been yelled at. I would have been ridiculed in public had I done there what I did here. But, you know, the worst I experienced was someone walking by and muttering, you know, the equivalent of faggot or something in Japanese.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But it wasn't so often.
Even then, I mean, just the idea that a Japanese person would go out of their way to say something derogatory like that.
Well, I mean, don't get me wrong. They didn't look at me. They didn't get in my face and say it. They just, we'd pass by the street and I'd hear them mumbling under their breath.
It's just so weird. But I guess I don't want to chop it up to it's just one of those crazy guys that you meet on the street anywhere, but it probably was.
Well, to a degree, but those guys are prevalent enough in every country, and it wasn't the only time that happened, you know? Mm-hmm. But like I said, it was a much less bumpy ride than it would have been had I been in the States, and I know that, and much safer for me. So I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to transition here, although, you know, I'm 181 centimeters / 5'11", so shopping for clothing doesn't really happen for me here, so I didn't really get to go through that whole thing, you know, which can be fun when you're transitioning to shop for new clothing. So yeah, I can't buy clothing or shoes in Japan. For those of you who might be listening and have not lived in Japan, you know, the clothing and shoes sold here are made to fit, well, I want to say in a blanket sense Japanese bodies, but that's not even entirely true. It's Japanese bodies within a certain range of tolerance. Even, I mean, there's plenty of Japanese people that are my size, not nearly as much as you would find in Western countries, but they also cannot buy clothing or shoes in the country that they're from. They have to outsource that to other online foreign places. In terms of what it's like, I did face some little bit of discrimination when I was job hunting, so for example, after my transition had reached a point where most people wouldn't have suspected that I had been born male. You know, there's a certain threshold that you pass where by and large people stop just blanket realizing this person's trans the moment you look at them. And I had gone to a job interview and everything had gone very well. They were very excited. I was slated to start on Monday, and then, you know, on Saturday afternoon they send me an email. Oh, I'm so sorry, we forgot to get your a scan of your passport. Can you send that over for us? Sure. Well, I hadn't been able to update my passport from what it used to look like. You know, I send that over an hour later. I'm sorry, we filled the position. Stuff like that. That happened more than once, you know. But I kind of understand having an ID that is so incredibly discordant with your appearance to such a strong degree. That doesn't mean that it's okay to just discriminate. And that was actually a Western person working for a Japanese company, but Japanese did it to me too. But the first job that I ever got, when it was the situation that my ID was very different than my appearance, including the sex marker, was a Japanese person, and she was very curious about all this. Whenever, you know, we finished our interview, she's like, "Great, I would love to have you. Can I get your documents? We're gonna scan these real quick." I handed them over, and she came back. She's like, "I think you gave me the wrong ID," and I was like, "No, that's my ID." And she's like, "But this is, wait, what?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's me," or it was anyway. And she's like, "No, wait, did you did you have a surgery? I'm like, we don't talk about
Yeah,
that.
right,
That's not
right.
so,
That's not part of the hiring
I
process
was
here.
like, and she's like, I'm sorry, I've never met one of you. And I was like, well, now you have. So yeah, but she was really sweet, actually. She was very supportive.
Just more curious than...
Yeah, it was harmless curiosity.
Right.
And I say harmless. It's harmless to me. It might have been harmful to other people. Some of the questions she asked, but I'm a pretty good sport, and I understand people's curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
If I weren't the way I am, I might be just as curious. You know,
right.
Try to utilize the tool of empathy as often as possible.
Do you think you would have experienced the same kind of reactions from those hiring managers if your passport had been updated with a picture and they would never have?
Well, I mean, they told me I had the job.
Right.
I was slated to start.
Right.
And then as soon as I show the ID, suddenly the position has been filled. I thought it had been filled by me. That's what they told me.
Right.
It's definitely cases of discrimination, right? And that's...
It's just so interesting because as someone who's not Japanese, I can't really comment on it. But when you're looking at somebody and you're saying this person fits the role, maybe it's just the American Californian in me, but who cares what your name is, where you're from, like, what your gender is, what you identify as, like...
Right, well, you're utilizing logic
right.
process, and the people who are prejudicial, it's not based on logic, right? It's based on emotion, which is cultivated through other people who have negative emotions based on connotations, pop culture references, things that their grandfather said, prejudice
kind of built into them.
It's never based on logic, because logically it doesn't, you can't follow that chain through logic. It doesn't work. Honestly, it's one thing, even if I came in at the beginning of my transition and I was very obviously in the middle of that transition moment, I could almost understand an argument for, children might be confused, whatever, blah, blah, blah. In that case, I wouldn't have liked it, and it wouldn't have been entirely on the up and up, but I could have gotten that. But the fact that everything's fine until you see my ID, that is most certainly prejudice. Few people in this world don't experience some form of prejudice. I'm sure you've gotten some form of prejudice for being Asian in the United States. And
I get it sometimes being Asian American in Japan. Because
I bet.
that's the confusing part for me sometimes, because I mean it's not the same level, but it's like, well, I don't understand. You're American? That's right. I'm born and raised in America. But you're Chinese? Yeah, because my parents are Chinese, but I was born and raised in America. But you're a foreigner, right? You're not Japanese. No, I'm not Japanese. I'm a foreigner. I was born and raised in America. I'm 100%. I identify as an American. I have zero knowledge of Chinese history and culture and whatever it is. And if anything, I have more knowledge about Japanese culture and history and whatnot. But I'm American. And I remember working at a daycare, and kids would ask me, they would say to me, like, in Japanese, like, teacher, you're Japanese, right? And then I would say, no, I'm American. And they would be like, no, you're definitely Japanese. And they're like 2-3-year-old kids, because they just don't know that it's possible for an Asian to be...
Right. Well, you have to think about it through their eyes, right? Like, all of the movies they're shown, all of the media, American equals usually white, blonde, etc., sometimes black. Everyone around them is looking Asian, so that's a disconnect for them. It's a mental disconnect, right? So I understand why that they would struggle with that at the beginning, but it's really helpful that you're one of their first contacts on this, because you are literally breaking prejudices before they form in their minds. So I think that's a very helpful thing. So after I got my ID, appropriate, I haven't really faced any of those issues.
Do you tell people when you meet them?
No. I mean, there's only one sort of person that I would tell, and that's if I have reasonable expectation of them entering the bedroom with me, because that's the only time that it actually matters.
Sure, right.
But yeah, no, I'm not the sort of person, I don't hide it. I don't make any efforts to hide it, but I certainly don't broadcast it either, just because it has no relation to anything I might be doing. It truly doesn't matter. It's something that's personal to me that I deal with, right? But it doesn't have any sort of social meaning past the point of someone potentially engaging in a romantic relationship with me. So
where do you think Japan will be in 5 or 10 years with this? Japanese people generally, at least I don't know, maybe you could inform me, but in Japan, there's not that many transgender Japanese people, are there?
There's the same amount of Japanese transgender people as every other country. It is a pretty static rate. The latest numbers I've heard, although admittedly I'm a little bit out of the loop, but it's estimated that at least 1, if not 2 out of every 500 humans is transgender, and that it's not location specific, right? So certain cultures might be more successful at suppressing those urges by, how they treat gender in their culture, and some less so. There's as many trans people as anywhere, just like there's as many gay people as there is anywhere.
Right.
Whether or not they're allowed to talk about it or explain themselves is a different story. But when I first moved here, I attended a party that was held in Kabukicho once a month called Propaganda. And Propaganda was a trans party. And I would go in there and, hang out and have fun and dance and drink with other trans. But yeah, there would be hundreds in there every month. Those parties have since stopped for some reason. I think the organizer just got tired of dealing with it all. She's a sweet lady. But, you can really notice how it's regarded by at least the older generation when you look at how the government treats it. So in order for a Japanese person to change the gender on their ID or the sex marker, they have to have had surgery, and you're not allowed to reproduce if you're transgender in Japan. If you want your ID to match your actual identity, which should be the case in all cases anyway for safety and accuracy, you have to be sterilized by the government.
So they make you basically commit to the most extreme degree in order just to simply...
Right, and as you may or may not know, not all transgender people opt for surgery of any kind, or maybe they opt for certain surgeries, but not bottom surgery, as we call it. So some people feel more comfortable, retaining the genitals they were born with, but everything else being, matching their identity, just because for some people it's scary. For some people, because, it's not like you just swap out one for the other and they work the same way.
Right.
It's not that simple. Right. But if you live in Japan and you want to change, like say you're someone like me, a male to female, you would need to not only get surgery, but also sterilized. And that's true for, like, if you're born female and transition to male, you have to let the government take away your ability to bear children.
That is insane.
It's draconic, it's archaic, and
it doesn't sound like the Japan that the world seems to love and adore, because these rules are written by people who clearly don't understand.
That is also fact.
And like almost every country, written by ancient people who are like in their 60s and 80s, and people who don't understand that just because you identify as a different sexual orientation that you need to be 100% committed. Well, yeah. It doesn't have to be in order to simply change your identification on a
to even more accurately match your appearance, right? Because it may be strange to you, but for the longest time, my legal ID was me with short brown hair and a beard, and yet I looked like this, and I got a lot of issues at the airports. When I was going through TSA, people thinking it's fake, and for good reason. Sure. It looks nothing like me.
Nothing. Right. By the way.
But, and so you want the ID to match the appearance of the person it represents, because that is accurate and legal and safest bet. But a lot of governmental bodies do not make that a very easy process.
Was it easier for you in the sense to change it in the States, and then when you come to Japan, they base that off of identification in the States, as opposed to changing it?
That is my only option, actually, although it wasn't as straightforward as it should have been. When I did finally get my passport legally changed to female and I brought it back to Japan, they continued for 2 years to give me male IDs.
Even with a female?
Because I didn't meet their requirements for changing it. However, I am legally married to a woman in Japan, and that is, I believe, the reason they kept it male. So it was like, yeah, one of these has to be wrong, but we would rather have the legality of the marriage, which is what my visa is based on. However, that changed a few months ago, and Japan finally gave me a female ID, and so now I am setting precedents over here. I don't think I'm the first or the only, but I'm certainly one of very few.
I don't know. Knowing you, Seralyn, I think you're a trailblazer. And I think you might be, honest to God, I mean, like in your situation, like you're probably the first person, particularly as a foreigner, to be able to do what you've been able to done. I don't think you have no predecessors before you. I think you're probably, if not the first person, you're probably like 1 second after the first person to be in this situation.
I have no idea. It's not. There's really no way for me to find out, but I'm thankful to finally have that, because that was the very last vestige of my history that remained on any sort of legal document, and it I'm a big girl. I can handle it, right? Seeing that little angry M on my ID, my Japanese ID.
Do you think Japan will change?
I think in order for Japan to change, they have to start communicating with the outside world. They still have the mentality of, are you aware of sakoku? Basically, for those who are listening and who don't have a lot of experience with Japanese history, there was a period of about 500 years where Japan did not allow anyone that's not Japanese to enter the island of Japan.
Yeah, they closed their country.
Closed country, yeah. So, and obviously that's not the case anymore, and it hasn't been for about 150, 160 years, but I think some vestiges of that mentality, just like when you see in the American South, slavery's been gone for how long, and yet you still have people waving those rebel flags, and you still have people saying
the remnants.
Comments. Right. So, like, it's gone, and it has been, but the kind of cultural genetic memory takes time to get out of there, and I think that once Japan starts communicating outside of need, communicating for the sake of communicating with the outside world a lot more, I think these sorts of concepts will gradually filter through. And I think that there also needs to be a major initiative for English to be taught in a way that makes sense in Japan. I'm not sure how much you know about how English is taught in public school systems here, but they use katakana to learn English. And
right.
That is the number one reason that they cannot speak English very well. Koreans, Vietnamese, Thai, Chinese are great at English, and it's because they don't use their languages to understand English. They learn English for what it is. Just like for me in Japanese. I was debilitated in my ability to learn Japanese so long as I insisted on learning it in Romaji.
Right.
Once I started learning Japanese in Japanese, that's when I got it. And it's the same issue that they face. They, in the Japanese school system, the way that they learn English is by memorizing nouns and verbs without ever learning how to apply them in real speech.
Right. It's just it's a lot of memory based. It's not a lot of practical use. Just they're not able to really think for themselves on how to use the language, but they just memorize.
It's a regurgitation.
Right.
It's nothing more. And until that changes, their ability to understand what's happening in the outside world will be handicapped, and it's a chain of effects, right? When their English gets better, they'll be able to see what's happening in the outside world, and then the generation that follows that will be the one to make changes to give Japan a more international sensibility, because it currently has a very old world mentality, which many people find charming, and in some ways is, but in other ways holds them back. Japan is not the innovative country it once was.
Do you think Japan or Japanese people want to open up? I mean, like you said, they're very closed. It's kind of built, I don't want to say built into their DNA, but built into their history that they're welcoming of foreign people and foreign cultures, but they stick to their own, and
right.
They don't really want to change that.
That's a good question.
And changing their belief, particularly in LGBTQ, it just seems so low on the totem pole of things that would change. They barely even, as it is now, being a foreigner is still a drastic stigma. So to be able to say you're even a Japanese LGBTQ or a foreign LGBTQ, it's not on the top of the list of things.
And simply put, you're right, it's not, but they also don't have a choice. So, they need an influx of human bodies. The only way that works out is if the sensibilities change to accommodate that sort of structural difference. They cannot continue doing things a certain old-fashioned way and it work out when you have an influx of people from different cultures. They have to make some changes, and I think a lot of their young people do realize that. I think the average age of a politician, I'm making a joke here, is like 97 or something.
Right.
Once there's a little bit of fresh blood that gets in there, and I don't even mean the people who are like 50 now. It's going to take another generation after that before we see something start to change, and then the third generation, the ones that are children now, they're going to grow up with access to the internet. They a wider sort of internet than we had access to growing up. They're going to see people. They're going to see two women holding hands. They're going to ask questions. They're going to wonder why that they never see that where they're from, and yet every other place seems to have it. They'll start to ask questions. It will happen. It's just going to take a while. Japan is a very traditional country that is not interested in change, and yet it must.
It's forced into a situation where they have to change.
They do.
Where they have to look at themselves in the mirror, get with the program,
right,
or dissolve. Yeah, not exist. Yeah. And it's something that I talked about previously with another guest on my podcast, but I brought up the question of, is the shrinking population a scary idea? And the previous guest said that although it is scary, like it might be inevitable and it might just be what they want. Japan will basically face an option. Option one, which is to open up to the rest of the world, whether that be, physically people coming in or just ideas. And option number two is stick to their guns and continue on as they are and
sink with the ship.
Exactly. And some people seem to, particularly Japanese people, might rather sink with the ship, which I think a lot of people from a Western perspective might think that's insane, but they rather sink with the ship and their traditions.
Built into their culture a little bit with things like seppuku, right?
Yeah, right.
But yeah, I think older folks probably feel that way. I think younger folks would like to see Japan succeed and be a major player on the world stage outside of the fact that they have a strong economy. One alternative would be for them to change the structure of their entire work-life balance, allowing people to birth enough children.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I 100% agree. And I also 100% agree that that's not going to happen.
Therefore,
by itself.
Right.
I think there has to be so many different changes along the way to make that happen, but...
So yeah, that has been my kind of experience in Japan. Rolla got quite a kick out of it. I had to tell her at one point because it was the first time I went on an international trip with her. So I'd been working with her for a few months, and I had to send in my passport to the company. Still had the passport with the beard and stuff on it from way back when I was 23. And I wanted to show her first because I didn't want them to say some, because if I just showed it to the company and the company, however they worded it to her, might have been weird. I wanted to tell her myself. So I was like, by the way, I need to tell you something. She thought I was joking, and which was a great flattery to me. Right. But she thought I was full of shit.
Because She's you're like, probably, you look so different than what you did before.
Over an audio format, you can't really see that, but yes, it's a remarkable change. And she just kept laughing. She was like, where's your real passport? Right. Or like, this joke is not that funny.
Yeah, okay, right.
But eventually I was like, I'm not joking.
Yeah.
And then she just kept playing. She's like, huh?
Yeah.
Huh? But she was really cool about it, actually. She's been really supportive. Perhaps the most fairy tale-like transition of all, I was coached on, style and fashion and, how to carry myself by a supermodel.
Right.
And given clothes and bags and shoes and things. Like, who gets that? Most people have to figure this out on their own and struggle with it. And I did struggle, but I had one hell of a teacher.
Yeah.
So for that, I am grateful, amongst a great number of other things.
Kind of switching topics and kind of going back. Working with a Japanese supermodel, particularly, what about the industry that a lot of people might not know about?
This isn't talked about very much. I was the first Western person to manage a Japanese celebrity, so I was privy to things that a lot of other people were, but I was the first one who felt that they were in a position to talk about it. The Japanese entertainment industry is run largely by the Yakuza, which is the Japanese mafia. Now, that doesn't mean that they handle day-to-day affairs. The company owners themselves do that, but any big moves, any power plays get run by them first. Approval on major changes. I have witnessed this multiple times myself. I have been chastised for not being deferential enough around some of these people who found me quite curious. I don't think the Yakuza often encounter, 5'11" transgender women from Mississippi. The Japanese entertainment industry is...
And you're talking about the entire industry, right? You're not just talking about the model industry.
There's like 3 talent agencies that don't play by those rules, but they also get ostracized, and they're not very successful on account of that. Mm-hmm. And I had half a mind when I stopped working with Rolla to open a talent agency, offering fair rates, not being involved with the Yakuza, and thinking that would be enticing to a lot of people. I knew I would make enemies along that path, but it's just, honestly, it's a lot of work, and I would have needed a business partner to execute that. There's just too much work. If it had been all in English, I might have been able to manage it, but it being all in super technical, legal Japanese, it was not a task I was up to in the end, and I pursued other endeavors. But I don't want to say that it's a dirty industry, but it's a pretty dirty industry. The rates that the companies take from the talents is past the point of highway robbery by Western standards. Like, just for a frame of reference, an agency or a management company in the US might take anywhere between 10 to 15, and if at absolute worst case scenario 20%, and you're not happy about it if it comes to that number. but Japanese agencies take 50 or more in some cases. That is if you're earning extremely large amounts of money, and even
like
so,
the top of the top.
Oh yeah, most of the issues we got into with Royal's management company was that we found that they were taking more than their stated 50% from her,
which is already, again, very high.
Astronomical.
Right.
More than double industry standards in other countries.
Triple, almost.
Yeah, pretty close to it.
But it's interesting because compared to the West, public figures in the West, they're normally the ones who are in control.
They're masters of their own careers.
But in Japan,
degree, yeah.
it's almost like the opposite, where the company's the one, and not just Japan, but Korea as well, for example. But the company's the one who controls their talents, image, or how much contracts maybe they get, or how they're supposed to act, or how they're supposed to portray themselves, things like that.
True.
They have entire controls over their lives, and like you mentioned earlier, they kind of get them while they're young, and when they're not big enough yet, when they're bigger, that's when they reap the benefits.
Right.
And even though they may not be pulling their own weight as much anymore later on down the road, maybe their viewpoint is, we invested in you when no one else did, and we made you who you are today because of us. Now you owe us in these high fees that they're charging, or I guess the cut that they're taking from the talents, compared to the West, which is more of, I don't know exactly how different, how to explain the differences are, but it's definitely different.
In a sentence, and by the way, very accurate insights. The dramatic differences when I was dealing with with Royal's American agency, how all of their actions were in efforts to support us. And in Japan, the efforts, frequently came across as support, but they were never not in efforts to control.
Yeah, I think we're kind of towards the end of our podcast here. I want to say thanks so much to Seralyn for being on the podcast. I hope we have another chance to have another episode about other things and other topics of Japan that we weren't able to talk about today. I know that you might be leaving Japan soon, which I do hope, but at the same time, I'm also sad about. But I hope our viewers definitely had a fun time listening about your experiences in Japan, your incredible professional background and experiences. I really think it's such a unique... It feels weird to be sitting on the bed of the ex-manager of Japan's most famous model and seeing that model on the train coming to this apartment today. It's just so weird.
It's never not weird for me too.
It's such a small world, and I really feel so blessed that the stars aligned and I get to meet such amazing people in this journey myself. So being able to sit across from you and interview you and get to know your insights on so many different aspects about Japan that most people will not be able to ever experience, I think is pretty cool. So I want to say thank you again for being on the show.
Those are some kind words, Michael. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. I'm glad that we got the chance to record it for posterity. And I hope that someone finds it interesting. For me, it's just my life. And I know it's been unorthodox and strange, but I'm grateful for it nonetheless. Each day I draw breath is amazing for me. So much love to you all, and I hope you enjoyed it. Take care.
And that wraps up episode 7 of the Why Japan podcast with Michael Tang. Seralyn has such an amazing story, and I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I did talking with her. Quick reminder, we have a Patreon. If you're interested in supporting the show, please visit patreon.com/whyjapanpodcast. You could also find us on Facebook or Instagram at Why Japan Podcast. As always, please share this with your friends if you find it interesting. The link is super easy to remember. That's whyjapanpodcast.com. I hope you tune in to the next episode of the Why Japan podcast with Michael Tang. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.